So, this is going to be a totally unstructured test recording, and we'll see how this goes. But basically, going to do a little bit of an introduction to UMG, and some of the tricks about it or the mistakes. So, first, I'm going to make a new widget, and I need to change my layout size so I can right-click easily. There we go. I'm going to go to user interface widget blueprints. Usually in studios they call this WBP because for widget blueprint, and then we're just going to call this something test. And the first thing what happens, and we'll full screen this, when you basically open up widget, you've got your details panel over here. And whenever you click on something in the hierarchy, that's this section, it'll give you the details panel, and then you have your widgets, what you can actually make up here in the top corner. Common ones, these are ones that generally take up space, so these are common things that you would use, most of these. And then the containers themselves would be these panel things. And so these are the things that will hold the contents that are up here, essentially. So there are containers, and then there are widgets that take up space. First thing I normally do is I just delete the canvas panel because they're overused and unnecessary most of the time. And I'll put in a nice little container. I like to use overlays, they're pretty simple. And the second thing I love to do is set my screen size to desired rather than fill. And that actually means that this is really the size of what this wants to render at. So if I drag in an image and I plop it in, now my container is the size of my image. My image size over here in the details panel is at 3232. I could put this to like 200 by 32. Hit compile, save, and now my container is always going to be the size of the largest thing inside, and the largest thing inside happens to be this image. If I set this back to fill screen, you can see it in its like strange context of like where it would be if this thing was the entire size of the screen. I find that really distracting and I don't need it, so I always set mine to desired. And especially useful when you're nesting widgets and widgets. This is truly the size of the widget when we're going to use it somewhere else. So let's actually use it somewhere else. I'm going to create a new blueprint. WBP, let's call this like, I don't know, list items, something like that. And all I have to do here, another canvas panel, immediately delete. And I want to say stack these horizontally, the buttons. So I'm going to use a horizontal box. I'm going to drag it into here. Set my thing again to desired, so it's always only the size of this thing. And then I might have made a mistake because I don't know if I can drag this easily in here. There we go. So now I've dragged my widget that I made earlier. And we could just basically duplicate this. And now you see that we've got ourselves a nice horizontal box that's perfectly stacking these widgets horizontally. We can replace with a vertical box, and then we could see them stacked vertically. And overlay would then stack them all on top of each other. And there's a bunch of other fun container widgets to play around with. But let's go back to horizontal box. So if I were to actually put in a real icon in here, so let me find an icon in the image here. You could either search in here, or my favorite way, if I'm in Unreal 5, because it has this little content bar here, I could just find myself an icon and drag it up into there. And it's gonna look like this because it's the image is set to 232. If I reset this, it's now 3232, but I think the actual size of this is like a 256 by 56. Or no, actually this is a material, so no wonder. And so that's the actual size of my texture. Now when I go back to my horizontal grid over here, or panel, they're basically all stacked horizontally, which will look nice. And also the size, so the size that this widget is taking is exactly 3 of these textures together, and since we know the size of the textures, a 256 by 256 is basically the size of this container is 256 by 2. Then let's say we actually want to place this inside of some, actual screen that's going to list maybe a bunch of items anywhere. So let's make a new widget. I have to change the size of my screen again so I can have an easy right click. User interface, WBP, item screen. And this is where I'd actually use a canvas widget, like we want it to be laid out, like say over here in the side, something like that. This back to full. And now I can take my list, and canvases are pretty awful. They do this thing, but I always like to, as soon as I have something inside, so the canvas and here's the slot, I always like to say size to content, and now this will always be the size of the content inside, rather than forcing it or doing weird scaling things. So in this canvas panel, you have a bunch of anchors. You could change, how this will all lay out. So let's assume I always want it centered and filled. So if I hit Control and Shift, it'll actually then fill this to be the center. So if you open this and hit Control and Shift and click, it'll basically do all of these fun little anchoring things, basically. That's great. Now, hit compile, save. Fantastic. If we go back to our original core thing, let's say we wanted to add text. If I add text in here, we're in an overlay widget, so the text would be up there. Maybe that works. Maybe we want the text to be, this is item title. And then let's say we wanted the description to be down here. So I would then wrap this with a vertical box and have text fill it in. So now that we have this overlay that contains both the item title and item, we could also duplicate the item title and align it to the bottom left. Actually, that looks terrible with this icon, but maybe over here, and this would be the amount, so the inventory amount 5, and we could put some left padding here, maybe 20, and bottom padding of like 10. And so now we have an item title, an item amount, and this would be the item description, and we want it to be centered and probably centered both on the text, and we probably want it to be a bit smaller. I don't know, 20 and not bold, regular. And we probably want this to have a little bit of a bottom padding between this guy and this guy. So I'm going to go to my padding, my bottom, and put like 10, so that there's some space between the item description and the icon. File save, and now when we go back to everything, look at that. We've got ourselves a lovely little layouts here, and it also still works in our core one. And then to show off sort of a problem that to think about with UMG, since UMG is all about the container is always the size of the content. So if my text, for instance, goes really large, or spills into lots of things, item description goes really long, and we have to suffer the size changes. So if I do this, you can see it's the longest. It's gonna break everything because it essentially is changing the size of the container, right? The container's only ever the size. The container is the size of the largest thing inside of it, and the largest thing inside of it right now is this text description because the text isn't wrapping. What I like to do is say this wrap text at, and since I know the icon size is 256, I would say wrap the text at 256. Now we've got that. Great. Let's go back to this guy. So now we have everything here pretty tight. So what we can do is we can go back into here, and what I then like to do is I could put padding on both these guys. I could say the padding to give it some space internally, so it'll always take space in the whatever slot. But oftentimes I'll just do a wrap with and overlay. Oops, not replace with. Wrap with and overlay. And this guy, and then my vertical box I can put some padding on. So the vertical box I could say padding 50 all around. So then we have a for sure padding around this whenever it gets placed into something. Like this, it'll have its fun little padding. This little icon up here will change the grid off and on. And so now we can have item descriptions, and every time this widget is loaded, we can put in a couple more, and the padding will be correct. And we could even then wrap this in with a vertical box and duplicate this horizontal. And now we basically just made ourselves a fun little grid. File save, and let's go back to the, yeah, here's the canvas panel. So it's actually taking up quite a bit of space, and that's because the size of this is pretty big in its original core thing. So, if you wanted to size this down, you could do it with a scale box. You could do it in the scale box here. You could do it in the scale box here, but I generally don't like to do that. I always like to be, my stuff is always supposed to be the size of my content. So for one, maybe the padding down here is too big. We could change the padding on the bottom. But also what is going to matter is changing the description maybe isn't always so long. So let's test that out with one of these. I'm going to go into my text here. I'm going to set it as a variable right up here. This isn't as important to know. This is just the way that I test stuff easily. Then I'll go into my layout. That's vertical box, and I'll turn the grids on so we can kind of see everything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first one, and I'm going to make the string really short, and the second one string really long, and then see what that looks like. So I'm going to grab my first widget, and then grab the text that's inside of it. Text. I don't want to set. Whoops. Text. I'm going to get it. Then I want to set text. And I'm going to change this to be a real short item description. Probably spelled that wrong, but it doesn't matter. And then I would like to use the event preconstruct to just test everything. So now you see the first one has short item description when I put there. And then I have this really long one. I'm actually gonna just copy and paste this and set that in my second one. So I'm always clicking around in here. So the second widget here, we're basically going to, gosh, I have the wrong copy and pasting. Oh well, it's gonna be obnoxious, but fine. After this, I'm basically just gonna take this, grab the same text block, but it's in my other target, it's in one, and I'm gonna go back to this guy and copy and paste these. And paste that guy in, compile, and go back here, and let's just change this to item description. So it's very, actually we want this on 2 lines. Item description on 2 lines to be average. Yeah. Technically it's on 3 lines. It's fine. So now, in my test, you can see here I've got a short item description, a really long one, and an average 3-line one. And everything is generally playing nice. So, I've got enough padding to kind of handle it going super large. But if it does go larger than 4 lines, it looks crazy. We could test that out by going in here and just adding more text into my test string. File save, go back, and now you can see when the layout starts when it's super long. And that's because, again, the whole size of this is being calculated by the largest thing inside of it, and the largest thing inside of it happens to be when the text starts breaking here. And so that's sort of the common problem, is everyone's trying to compensate for the sizes of containers changing and being obnoxious like this. Uh, One way you could do it is you could wrap this in a scroll box and then wrap that guy with a size box. And the size box, we could say a maximum desired height, and you could say you can only ever be, you know, 125 high, and if not, then the scroll box will take over. So then you see here we've got a scroll bar for when the item is long, or like you could actually then do some uh calculations to be like, okay, I start shrinking the font size depending if it's reaching a certain length that isn't far. But in general, it's just understanding to have the space, the extra 40% for localization and everything else designed in your layouts, and you won't have to constantly be fighting the size boxes because or scale boxes, because everything is the size that you intended to be. But again, my padding on the bottom here is probably too intense, so I'm going to change the padding on the bottom here to be like 10 so that it doesn't take up, and same with the top. I don't really need the top to have that much padding, maybe only 10. Hit compile, save, and now our items are a bit tighter together, which looks pretty good. And again, the arrows here are kind of fun. You could swap which things work in what kind of containers. So that's basically the common thing, is everything is going to be determined on the largest sized item. So understanding that for layout space and making sure that you're utilizing and capitalizing on that. And then so here's our lovely canvas panel that I never truly enjoy. I'll turn back on the grids. You can see it. So this thing is the canvas, and this is the content inside. Again, if you didn't check this size to content, and we change the anchor to like maybe center, and it's then not gonna honor it or shrink it. So I just always hit size to content and really try to make sure that everything is the size it needs to be in the very core root thing. So if we did want to say size this down, we could say 256 was too big for our texture, but to keep it in the square ratio, we could say it's 200 by 200. Center align it so it's smaller, and then the description could be longer because our description is set to wrap at 256 down here, but you could set this to 200 as well. And so now we've actually got a tighter layout, a smaller layout, and I don't have to do anything crazy. I don't have to change any scale boxes. Instead, I'm just thinking smartly, like, what is the thing that's actually changing the size of the layout? And it is the core widget. So that's essentially that. Fun thing to know about anchors and this sort of thing. So I could anchor it to the bottom. Remember, I'm holding Control and Shift. And let's say I wanted to space it out evenly. So I want these guys to evenly fill the spaces. And to do that, I would select all of these guys and set it to fill. And select all these guys and set it to fill. And in theory, yes, now it's actually filling up the space equally, since they're all set to fill 1 across the entire bottom of the layout here. And if I didn't want that, I could also set this back to always be vertically centered. And now they're still set to fill, but now it's not trying to fill up the entire container it might exist in. Now it's only set to align to the center of the container that it will exist in. So that's the alignment here. Again, if you set the alignment to fill on these boxes, then wherever this gets placed, it will be then try to fill its entire whatever the container has. And so that's the container is set to fill the full screen. Then the inside widget container is going to set to fill the entire area. And then you could, in theory, go in here and set the text to also fill, and then the text would fill in all the areas. But usually that ends up being quite difficult to manage, so I usually avoid those sort of things. Yeah, that's a little bit of a layout. What UMG wants to do, how to kind of work with layouts, how to know your alignments and your padding, and again, work with the desired versus the fill screen. I find it's much more helpful to actually see, like, okay, this is how much space it's going to take up minimum, and if it isn't set to fill, then it's not, or to horizontally or vertically fill the space, this is always what it's going to render at size-wise. Then you can go into placing this widget anywhere and seeing, oh, you know, if it's centered, going to do that. The other thing with anchors is how it's actually going to scale down with different resolutions. If it's bottom anchored, try to wrap this with a size box, or no, a scale box, just to show you what it would kind of look like if this is being scaled down for DPI reasons or other things. If I say user specified, you can see it's going to scale to the bottom. So this is how, like, if it's changing resolutions, it's going to scale that way down there. But if my anchoring is set to, and again, I'm always holding shift and control at the same time, it's set to anchor perfectly in the center, it's going to do that. Fill middle, it's going to then do this. All these different ways of anchoring will determine how it's going to scale down. So it's just understanding anchoring. And again, I always say size the content. Other people will then force a size. I never force a size if I can avoid it. Again, I'm always trying to make sure that the content is properly sized right and the layout doesn't need to size to it. Yeah, hopefully that gives a little bit more understanding of what UMG wants to do and how it wants to anchor, scale, and think about layouts and ways that you can kind of avoid issues by having either scroll boxes or allow yourself the space in your layout to handle lots of lines of text and not have to force scale boxes or size boxes. Yeah. So, the dry run probably isn't the most organized. I'll probably have to think about it and record a different video, but hopefully it helps.